Hello, welcome to Archive West Texas. I'm your host, Gordon Wilkerson. Also in our studio today, the man who makes this all happen, our producer, Thomas Dye. We're pleased this morning to welcome Dr. Donald Bricker and his wife, Sammy Lou, to our studios. Dr. Bricker is a pioneer in cardiovascular surgery in the Lubbock area. He's got a wonderful life story to share with us. We're just really pleased and grateful to have Dr. Bricker with us this morning. Welcome, Dr. Bricker.
Thank you, Gordon.
First part of your book talks about you growing up in Sheridan, Wyoming.
Yes.
I understand you were born in Denver, and your father was in the baking business, and your family made its way across a couple of destinations before getting to Sheridan. Tell us about your early years, your family, what you learned from your mother and your father, and what growing up in Wyoming was like.
So, Dad ran a business in Denver first. I think it was a magazine distribution center. And there's a small town called Torrington, Wyoming, and my dad's brother worked in a bakery in Torrington. And my dad went to see him as a visit just because his brother was nearby. And they were having trouble, and the baker of that institution couldn't turn out a decent oven load of bread. So the guy who owned the bakery was a wealthy individual who had made his money, it was said, bootlegging in that time. And my uncle told him that my dad was a real sharp guy and could probably straighten out his business. Well, my dad had graduated from a baking school in Fort Dodge, Iowa, and so he said, well, I'll be glad to try to help him. And so my dad took over the making of the bread, and he made the dough and according to his formula, and he baked it and everything, and it was great. And the man who owned the business was so impressed that he gave my dad $100, which in those days was just a lot of money. And so my dad sat down with the baker and wrote it all out for him, and the next day bread was inedible again, so he gave my dad another $100. And finally, this went on back and forth, as you might imagine, until the wealthy owner fired the baker and hired my dad for $100 a week, which again at that time was a lot of money. And so he started that business out, and then he bought a bakery in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the capital, and he worked that bakery up until it was making a lot of money. And during this time, I came along, and he moved to Thermopolis, Wyoming. Thermopolis is the site of the world's largest mineral spring, and the whole town was built around this warm hot spring. And that's where I remember my first remembrances of life were in Thermopolis, Wyoming. And we lived above the bakery that he ran. So my dad got tired of that life. He reached an agreement with the owner to buy one of the chain. He'd set up a chain of bakeries. They were all called wigwam bakeries. The wigwam bakeries, the Indian word, for dwelling.
Yes.
And so he bought the one in Sheridan, which he thought was the nicest part of the state, and which I would still agree with. But we had the Wigwam Bakery in Sheridan, Wyoming, and that's where I grew up. And so I did that and went to school. I started school early. I frankly just think my mom wanted to get rid of me, so she sent me to school when I was 5 years old instead of 6. And so it was difficult being in the low rung on the ladder. I had quite a few scraps from the older boys who were picking on me until they learned better. But It hurt me most when I was in high school and playing high school football, and everybody was bigger and older than I was, and we had farm kids that, weighed 200 pounds. And in those days, if things didn't go well for the farm family, they'd haul the kids out of school frequently and keep them at home to work on the farm. So a lot of these farm kids, we had one guy on our football team who was 21 years old. and nobody thought much about it. And how this guy got into high school, I don't know, because he came back from the Korean War and he played high school football, and he weighed 240 pounds, and he was a force to be reckoned with in the middle of a line. Anyhow, I graduated from Sheridan High School, and this was in the Second World War, and that's where I grew up. And I had decided at that time that I wanted to be in the military. In specific, I wanted to go to West Point. Now, in those days, Army was #1 in the country. You remember Army and Navy played their famous games every
Yes.
season. And so I wanted to go to West Point. Well, you had to have either a political sponsor, and we didn't have any money of that type, to influence a representative. But I took a series of civil service examinations. I wrote West Point, and they said, well, here's the alternate route. And I took 3 or 4 of those, and of course they weren't for 14-year-old kids, but I managed to do quite well on those exams. So after 2 years of this, when I was 16, I got a letter that was appointed alternate from the state of Wyoming. So I thought that was great. And then in my senior year in high school, I was told to meet with all of the other candidates from the 13-state region, of which Wyoming was one, in Denver, Colorado, for exams for possibly, becoming a primary candidate for the state of your residence. So I went there, and I'll never forget that because it was a really life-changing experience. Those boys, those young men that I met, were the best kids I had ever been around. They were all smart. They were all good athletes. And we just all hit it off immediately. And everybody wanted everybody else there to get an appointment. Because we melded so completely. I'll never forget that.
Let's take a quick break here. I want to remind our listeners that if you have a suggestion for a future guest here on Archive West Texas, please email us at info@classical1057.org. Thank you for listening. We'll be right back. All right, we're back in studio with Dr. Donald Bricker. Let's talk a little bit more about the medical training and the mentors that you had and what you learned, and then how that led to your ultimately taking a residency with Dr. DeBakey in Houston.
Well, I remember very well when the first class we were given, the professor of medicine stood up, and he was a rather portly gentleman with a nice beard, and gave us an introductory lecture. He stood up in front of us on a platform for speaking, and he looked us over, and then he said, "Gentlemen, You are nothing. You are nothing. Your patient will be everything, and you will remain nothing. You will never, ever do anything which is not in the best interest of your patient. Do I make myself clear? And I don't think they give that speech anymore. But anyhow, I started off with the class, and we had some funny things that happened in gross anatomy. You have a cadaver, and you're given a textbook, and you're going to have 6 weeks to learn everything, every anatomical term and every anatomical particle for the final examination. And my partner was a boy who played football from Rutgers, and we hit it off just so well. We became very close friends very quickly and had a lot of fun. But we got through that pretty well, and we became very close friends, and I developed some good friendships with the rest of them, and those of us that lived in proximity in the dorm became good friends. And, there's a lot of fuss now about those institutions persecuting Jewish students. Well, Cornell, like New York City, was 25% Jewish. And my first roommate was a Jewish boy after the young man who was the Quaker left. And I never saw any persecution, but Cornell admitted that they had a policy of restriction for not just for Jews, for everyone. They wanted a class that was representative of the whole country. I think that's why they took me, because they thought I was a wild Indian.
You were representing the West.
And they said that they live in a city that's 50% Jewish at that time, and every Jewish mother in the city wants to have my son the doctor, And so they'd have a class that would be 100% Jews because they were all smart and they were all qualified, and so they cut it off at 25%. But it was not done with any kind of prejudice or anything. It was just a simple expedient. And we always had 6 girls and 1 black student.
Well, tell our listeners some of the training that you got in general surgery and some of the professors that mentored you.
The first year is spent with really basics, anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and that sort of thing. And we never saw a patient. In the second year, we began to be introduced peripherally to the medicines. We're given courses in physical diagnosis, how to listen to a stethoscope, what to hear, how to apply, how to examine the body, where to stand for each organ, and this sort of thing. And it's all gone now. Nobody even examines anybody really like we did. We were taught to examine every single orifice, and we did, and that was just a physical examination. But in the laboratory in biochemistry, we did experiments on animals and didn't see any patients really until the third year. And also at that time, we experienced introduction to dog lab. Dog lab is where we learned to do basic surgery on the anesthetized dogs. And I'll never forget, I had no idea what, if any, specialty I was going to pursue. And I thought that I had the intellectual bent to be most happy being an internist, a diagnostician. And I was working at the dog lab one day, and I heard this big voice behind me. He said, "See that this boy goes into surgery. He ties knots better than I do." And it was the professor and chairman of the Department of Surgery. And I thought, I always thought I'd be an internist, but if someone sees a particular talent that I wasn't aware of, I'd go that way.
So was that just a natural gift that you had, or had you developed that from working in veterinary fields?
No, interestingly enough, I started out playing the piano, and I had a real talent for that. I got to the point where I could turn my back on the piano and she could play a song and I would write it out. I could write out the music from listening to her play it. And then I made the biggest mistake that I can remember in my young life. I decided to give up my piano lessons and play football instead. It's a terrible mistake. I regret now that I did that, and I wished I could play the piano. But I played the piano, and I played it well for my age. And I also was an excellent typist. I was the only boy in the typing school, and my teachers in high school said, Don, your writing is so bad you will not get through college unless you take typing. So I learned to type, and as a matter of fact, I was the number one typist in the class. I could type 110 words a minute with no mistakes. And so I typed everything, and after the end of the first year, I realized I didn't have enough money to pay for my second year. So I've got to get a job. So I volunteered for every experiment they had. You know, I got stuck with needles all over, and I took all kinds of drastic medicines that were foul. And then I found that they paid the students, the workers who typed the discharge summaries. And I think they paid something like, I don't know, $5, or something an hour. And so I went down and asked if I could get the job typing discharge summaries. Well, I knew the terminology better than any of the typist pool, and I could type faster than any of them. So after I had been there for, I guess 2 or 3 months, the head of the typing pool called me in and said, they called us all doctor at that time, even though we were students. Dr. Bricker, he said, we're changing your arrangement. And I said, what do you mean? Stammering, a little bit nervous that I might be losing my job. And she said, no. He said, you type 3 times as many summaries as anybody here in the typing pool, and we are going to, instead of paying you by the hour, we're going to pay you by the summary. And I think they were paying me, I think it was $5, $10 to type the discharge summary, which was usually about a 3-page written sheet. And I could go down any time. I could go down at 2 o'clock in the morning, when I was through studying or something, and type for an hour and make $20, $30. I don't remember. It was a lot of money in those days.
Yes.
So I did that to get through. I said,
all right, let's take one more quick break here. We'll be right back with Dr. Bricker. All right, welcome back to Archive West Texas. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Donald Bricker. So Dr. Bricker, your good friend Bob Salem calls and says, hey, I've got an opportunity out here to establish some cardiovascular surgery in Lubbock, Texas. And your initial response is, where's Lubbock? At the time, Lubbock's a community of around 100,000. Methodist Hospital has, I think, 220-something beds. Tell us what establishing that was like and how you grew that practice.
Well, the interesting thing was this was just after the hurricane hit.
The tornado.
The tornado, yeah. And the joke in Houston was that Don Bricker was going to Lubbock, but it blew away.
Well, they weren't all wrong.
So anyhow, we came out here with our crew, and there were a lot of people that did not want an open heart program in Lubbock. that was considered very avant-garde and too advanced for Lubbock, and it was going to cost a lot of money to buy all the machinery we needed and train the people we needed. And a lot of the surgeons were unhappy because Mr. George Brewer, who was then the administrator, was taking out of their budgets to buy for our budget. So we arrived with a little bit of animosity among the surgeons, resented the open heart program getting so much attention. So we managed to teach the people we needed to show them what they needed to know and do in order to help this program. And Sammy gave lectures to the nurses and everything to let them know what we expected and what we needed. And we trained some nurses and went through mock procedures after many of those, actually, until they were comfortable with what was going to happen. And we had two cardiologists here at the time who were catheterizing cardiologists, Dr. Sam King and Dr. Joe Arrington. And Sam was a real character. He was as smart a clinician as anybody I ever knew. And Sam used to walk around with his clothes in a state of decay, and yet if you asked Sam about a clinical opinion, he was invariably correct. He was really a brilliant man. And Joe Arrington was a little bit the opposite of Sam. He was always beautifully dressed and formally attired, if you will, and greeted everybody and conducted himself in that manner. And he had a tour at the New York hospital, so we had a little bit of a bond there together because we'd both trained at the New York hospital at various times in our careers. But they were the ones who were doing the catheterization and picking the patients for surgery. And they wanted to start with a sure winner, of course. And so we found this young girl, Jeannie Morales was her name, as the first patient we had, and she had a hole in her atrial septum that needed to be closed. And so we got everybody together, and there was a big fussment about who should be the anesthesiologist. And of course, Ray Wilson had come down and watched, and we all just assumed. But the anesthesia people had a talk about doing it, and they decided one of the more senior people should do it. And so Dr. George Beck did the first anesthesia. And we did the case, and it went very well. And Dr. Beck said that he'd never seen a smoother case, and he was the one who was selected because he had done, in his training, some open heart anesthesia. But the first case went well. My assistant was Dr. Bob Salem. And we sewed the defect shut, and the patient did very well, and we still have occasion to see her and remember her. And she's always come to any meeting of the Open Heart Club at our suggestion. So we were off and running, so to speak, and I was promised a bunch of easy cases. And I remember the second case was a triple coronary bypass, which in those days was not an easy case. And the third case was a double valve replacement that had a 50% mortality in a lot of programs. But we managed to get through, and I think we did, well, out of the first 100 cases we did, we lost 2. So we had a mortality that was better than any reported, frankly, at that time. And Dr. Martin Dalton was my assistant for most of these, who was in thoracic surgery here, the leading thoracic surgeon in town when I got here. So Martin wanted to be involved and was, and He also wanted to be able to do hearts, but the aura surrounding heart surgery is one that isn't, at that time, present with anything else, because you know that things are going to go wrong sooner or later, and that when they do, there's going to be a catastrophe. And Martin was never comfortable with that, because he didn't grow up with it, so he really didn't wear that overcoat very well. But we were partners for many years until he took a teaching position at a medical school in the South. And we got to the point where we were doing, cases every week, and I slept beside every patient for the first 5 years, for the simple reason that the nurses they were bright girls, but they had no experience with monitoring a patient immediately after heart surgery, and there are too many things going on that can go wrong that you have to anticipate in order to correct them before they manifest themselves completely. So the only way to do that is to take care of open heart surgery patients. And after you've done a few hundred, then you know pretty well what's happening when this vital sign does this, or one of the heart rhythms is such and such. And so anyhow, the hospital gave me a room for a single bed recovery, and adjacent to that room was another room that I could have a little cot in, and I'd sleep in that. And if the nurse needed me in the middle of the night, all she had to do was, then I was there. But it worked very well, and I think I did that for quite a while until the nurses felt comfortable enough to call me at home.
Yeah. Thank you again for joining us today on Archive West Texas. Our special guest today has been Dr. Donald Brinker. Hope you join us again next week for another episode of Archive West Texas.